Oven Ready is a spooky story about crazy babysitter. Mr. and Mrs. Collins received a last-minute invitation to a very important cocktail party at the country club. It was the sort of invitation they had been hoping to get for more than 2 years, and now that it had arrived, even at the last moment, they were thrilled. Naturally, they wouldn't be able to take their 6-month-old son, Christopher, to the party, and they needed a babysitter badly. Lucy Collins quickly called her regular babysitter but found the girl already had a date that evening. Her second-choice babysitter had another job that evening, so did the third. Mrs. Collins was getting a bit frantic. She was afraid that she would have to miss the cocktail party after all, an enormous disappointment since she had waited so long and wished so hard for the invitation. She called her regular babysitter back to plead with the girl to break her date and do her a favor just this once. The girl's date was every bit as important to her as the cocktail party was to Mrs. Collins, and she refused. Still, the girl felt very sorry for her. Mrs. Collins was pleading and asking her if she knew of anyone at all, who was free that evening to babysit for Christopher. The girl thought for a moment. She knew these last-minute jobs were always hard to arrange, particularly on a Saturday night. Mentally, she ticked off a list of names, discarding first this one and then that one because she knew they would be busy. Then she remembered Carrie Barker. Sure, Carrie was a little weird, a little mixed up. But basically she was a good kid, eager to please, and she would probably welcome the job. She didn't get many sitting jobs because most parents didn't like her looks. Well, if you are really desperate, the girl said, there's Carrie Barker. She doesn't live too far away. I'll give you her phone number. Mrs. Collins was deeply grateful for the information and called Carrie Barker immediately. On the phone, Carrie sounded strange and a bit out of touch. But she was perfectly willing to babysit and said she would come right over. By the time Mrs. Collins made the arrangements on the phone, Mr. Collins was pacing up and down anxiously looking at his watch. It was all right to be a little late to a cocktail party, but if you were too late, then everyone would notice, and that wasn't a good idea. When the doorbell rang, signaling the arrival of the sitter, he was very much relieved. Thank God, she's finally here, he said. It was easy to see why Carrie Barker had trouble getting babysitting jobs. Her clothes were strange and her hair was wildly unkempt. Most unsettling and disturbing was the distant, almost vacant, look in her eyes. As Mrs. Collins showed Carrie around the house, the baby's room, the kitchen, and the bathroom, the girl moved almost like a sleepwalker. When she presented Carrie with a piece of paper on which had been written a name and number where they could be reached in case of emergency, the girl didn't even glance at it but crumpled it and pushed it into the pocket of her jeans. Carrie Barker's appearance and actions were so strange that Mrs. Collins toyed with the idea of making up some excuse, paying the girl off, and then just staying home herself. Mr. and Mrs. Collins had a heated whispered conversation about this. Mr. Collins finally convinced his wife that there was nothing really wrong with the new sitter. It's just the way the kids are today. And so, with a considerable feeling of unease hanging over her, Mrs. Collins was persuaded to go to the party, leaving her baby behind with the sitter. The feeling of doom grew on Mrs. Collins as the evening wore on. While others walked about chatting and laughing, Mrs. Collins stood grimly in a corner, hardly talking to anyone. At least try to look like you're having a good time, muttered her husband. It was no use. She was much too anxious to enjoy herself, or even to pretend to. Mrs. Collins found a phone and called her home. Hello. The voice sounded hollow, but it was definitely Carrie Barker's. Oh, Alio, Carrie. I'm just calling to see if everything is all right. Oh sure, Mrs. Collins VE made dinner for when you get home. The turkey's in the oven. That's nice, dear. Thank you so much. It was only after she hung up that the shock hit Mrs. Collins. Turkey? What turkey? There was no turkey in the house. She rushed up to her husband and said, "We've got to go home at once. Something terrible may have happened." He tried to calm her, but she was not to be put off this time. Rather than have his wife make a scene, Mr. Collins made some hasty excuses and they left. He was angry, she was frightened. They didn't talk much while driving home. When they arrived, they were greeted by the smell of cooking. The dining room table was set with the family's best china and crystal. The lights had been turned out and there were candles on the table. Carrie was standing in the kitchen. "Turkey's almost ready," she said. "See." She opened the oven door, revealing the baby inside. It seems that the girl had been taking drugs, and her brain had been so messed up that she had mistaken the baby for a turkey. Lake Vermilion is a true scary story about a group of friends who see something horrifying when they are camping in a cabin one night. The story you are about to read is true and not made up in any way. One of my friends actually suffered a nervous breakdown after the incident and needed to go into counseling. I had 3 really good friends and their names were Kevin, Ryan, and Tommy. Every summer, our parents would take us on vacation. We always stayed in a remote cabin in the forests of Minnesota. The cabin was located on a large island in the middle of Lake Vermilion. Eventually, when we were old enough, our parents let us go to the cabin on our own for the first time. The cabin was quite small and it only had a kitchen, a bathroom, and 2 bedrooms. At night, it was pitch black. There were no street lights for miles and the only light came from the moon. On the 3rd night of our trip, we set up a campfire by the edge of the lake. The moon was full and the pale white glow was shimmering across the lake. We were gazing up at the stars when all of a sudden we heard a splashing sound, as if something was moving about on the water. Ryan suddenly stood up and pointed, saying, "What the hell is that?" We all looked in the direction he was pointing, peering into the darkness. After a while, I could make out what he was pointing at. I'll never forget the feeling of terror that came over me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up and goosebumps appeared on my arms. I was paralyzed with fear. Out in the middle of the lake, there was a woman's head. It was just floating there on the surface of the water, staring directly at us. She had pale white skin and long black hair that was matted across her face. The rest of her was submerged or not even there. We tried to tell ourselves it was just a loon. They're black and white birds that hunt at night, diving deep into the water. It didn't look like a loon, but that's what we tried to convince ourselves it was. We threw some more wood on the fire and tried to forget about it, but it still gave me the creeps. About an hour later, I had to go to the toilet, so I walked down to the edge of the dock and peed into the lake. Looking out over the moonlit lake, I noticed the thing was still there, but now it was much closer. It still looked like a woman's head and it still seemed to be staring right at me. Its face was still extremely pale, as if it hadn't been out in the sun for years, and I could easily make out some facial features, the eyes and the nose. A feeling of incredible unease came over me as I realized it couldn't be a loon. There was no way a loon could tread water for that length of time. There were no ripples around it either. It wasn't moving at all. It was just standing there, stiff as a board, submerged in the water. I immediately zipped up my pants and ran back up the dock to where my friends were, sitting around the campfire. I told them what I had seen, but none of them dared to go down the dock to take a closer look. We tried to tell ourselves it was just a log or a tree branch, jutting out of the water. I could tell everyone else felt uneasy too. None of us really believed that. We went back into the cabin and shut the door, locking it behind us. It was very late and we needed to sleep. None of us mentioned the thing in the lake. We were all trying to avoid talking about it. There were no curtains on the windows, and as I was getting ready for bed, I couldn't help taking one last look. Peering out the window, I could see the lake clearly, illuminated by the full moon, but the thing wasn't there anymore. It had completely vanished. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking the log must have floated away or else it just sank below the surface. Or perhaps it had been a loon after all, and it had finally flown away. It was very hot that night and we had to sleep with the windows open. My friend Tommy and I slept in one bedroom and my 2 other friends, Kevin and Ryan, slept in the other bedroom. We left our bedroom doors open. I was finding it hard to sleep. It was the middle of summer and there wasn't even a slight breeze. The heat was stifling. As I lay there, I thought I could hear someone walking around outside the cabin. I kept my eyes tightly shut and tried to tell myself it was just my imagination. It sounded like someone with bare, wet feet, pacing back and forth. I was trembling with fear, but I felt so weak, I couldn't move. The footsteps sounded like they were walking up the steps to the cabin door. I wanted to shout out to my friends, but I was frozen in terror. Then, the footsteps turned around and sounded like they were running down the steps and towards the lake. After a while, the footsteps faded away and there was only silence. I reached over and shook my friend Tommy. He was already awake and he claimed he had heard the footsteps as well. Just then, I was startled to see Ryan come running into the room. When he stepped into the moonlight, I could see his face and the expression on it was very disturbing. "We need to leave," he croaked. "Why?" I asked. "What did you hear?" "Let's just go," he insisted. "Let's get to the boat. It's time to go." He wouldn't answer. He just ran back into his room. We followed him and found Kevin sitting on his bed, already packing up his things. Ryan was running around, frantically grabbing his stuff and stuffing it into a bag. "What's wrong?" I demanded. "Ryan, what the hell is wrong with you? Tell us." He just stopped in his tracks and stared at me. There was a haunted look in his eyes. I will never forget what he said. He told us he was turning over in his bed to get more comfortable when he suddenly saw at the top right corner of his window. Someone was peeking in. As soon as he set eyes on it, the face vanished. He said all he saw was long black hair, hanging down the window, ghostly white skin and one large eye staring at him. When he said that, it chilled us to the bone. We realized that if the face was in the top right corner of the window, that meant the thing had to be damn near 8 feet tall, or else floating in mid-air. I felt like I was going to be sick. "Let's just go," Ryan said in a very serious tone. "Let's just go now." We all agreed and packed our stuff as quickly as we could. We grabbed our bags and ran out of the cabin, using only to lock the door behind us. As we scrambled down the front steps, I glanced to the side and saw footprints, bare, wet footprints, in the dirt all around the cabin. We ran down to the boat and threw our stuff in. We untied the boat from the dock and sped off. I looked back over my shoulder and stared at the island, but I didn't see anything moving. However, I had the strangest feeling that someone or something was watching us. When we finally reached the other side of the lake, we tied up the boat, stuffed our backpacks in the car and drove off. We had been driving for about 10 minutes when, out of the blue, Ryan suddenly broke down sobbing. He kept saying over and over, "What was it, guys? Oh God. What did I see?" On the way, we called our parents to tell them what had happened. Ryan was freaking out and we didn't know what to do. They told us to just get home safely and quickly. My friend's dad went up to the cabin a few days later and said he saw nothing out of the ordinary. However, he did mention that there were bare, wet footprints all around the cabin which he thought was odd. Whatever Ryan saw in the window really hit him hard. After his breakdown, he had trouble sleeping and ended up having to go into therapy. They gave him some pills to calm him down and allow him to get a decent night's sleep. As time went on, he recovered and ended up being fine, but to this day, he still can't sleep unless the curtains on his window are completely shut. To this day, I still cannot explain what we saw in the lake that night. I never went back to the cabin. Tommy and Kevin have both gone back and everything was fine, but Ryan refuses to go back and, frankly, I'm with him. I Want to Be a Vampire is a scary story about a weird and unpopular teenage boy who is obsessed with death, darkness, blood, and the devil. There was a teenage boy named Lorcan who said he wanted to be a vampire. Everyone thought he was just looking for attention. He didn't have any friends. All of the kids in school were afraid of him. He was odd-looking and his head seemed too large for his body. He was unnaturally thin and his eyes were sunken and had dark circles around them. His cheeks were hollow and his skin was a deathly shade of pale. He dressed in black from head to toe. He wore a long black trench coat that resembled a cape. When the other kids were playing sports, Lorcan would be sitting in the corner of the schoolyard, engrossed in one of his books. He collected books about vampires, devil worship, and satanic rituals. He read each one over and over, feverishly underlining passages and taking notes. There were always strange rumors about him floating around the neighborhood. Some younger children claimed they had seen him murder a dog and drink its blood. Others said he would kidnap cats in the neighborhood and bring them home so that he could perform weird experiments on them. His parents were worried sick about him. His odd behavior unnerved them and they didn't know what to do with him. They brought him to doctors and psychiatrists, but none of it did any good. One night, his mother found some of his books. When she realized they were about Satanism, she was horrified and threw them in the garbage. Lorcan didn't complain or protest, but when his parents went to bed, he crept downstairs and went outside to retrieve his beloved books from the trash. The next day, he made a big hole in the ceiling of his wardrobe. It was his secret passage and it allowed him to crawl up into the attic unnoticed. He kept all his books there, safe from prying eyes. The attic became his secret place. He even constructed a makeshift altar and decorated it with satanic symbols, upside-down crosses and crude drawings of the devil. One night, he broke into the local church and stole a silver chalice and some communion wafers. He brought them home and placed them on his altar. During the day, Lorcan was sleepy and lethargic, but at night, he would come alive. While his mother and father were asleep, he would creep around the house barefoot, trying not to make the slightest sound. Sometimes he would creep soundlessly into their bedroom and stand over them, watching their peaceful slumber. One day, the teacher gave everyone in the class an assignment. They had to write an essay entitled "When I Grow Up." The teacher asked if anyone wanted to read their essay out loud to the class and Lorcan raised his hand. He stood in front of the blackboard holding a crumpled piece of paper and cleared his throat. "When I grow up," he began, "I want to be a vampire." The other kids rolled their eyes and giggled. Lorcan was so excited, the paper was shaking in his hands. "I want to sleep in a coffin," he continued. "I want to surround myself with death. I want to dedicate myself to evil and get revenge on all my enemies. I will surrender my soul to Satan and accept him as my Lord and Savior." "That's enough, Lorcan," the teacher interrupted. Lorcan ignored her and his voice grew louder. None of his classmates were giggling now. "I want to drink the blood of little boys and girls and feel it coursing through my veins. I want to sink my teeth into the soft flesh of my victims and feel their hot blood trickling down my throat." "Stop it, Lorcan," the teacher cried. "Sit down. I want to rip them open, pull out their insides and feast on their entrails. I want to destroy every living thing. I want to burn the world. I want to kill everyone who made fun of me." The teacher lunged at him, snatching the paper out of his hands. Lorcan clawed at her and screamed like a mad thing. As she grabbed him by the neck and marched him off to the principal's office, he was yelling, "I want to be a vampire. I want to kill you all. I want to kill you all." Lorcan was suspended from school and his parents had to meet with the teacher and the school principal. After that, everyone watched him like a hawk. Neighbors would pull their children off the street if they saw him coming. Rumors spread quickly about him and nobody wanted anything to do with him. One day, a little boy who lived in the neighborhood went missing. His parents searched for him, but there was no sign of him anywhere. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The police were called and they knocked on every door in the area, asking questions. One officer questioned Lorcan and noticed he was acting very nervous. The policeman had a bad feeling about the teenager and he insisted on speaking to his mother and father. Lorcan's parents let the policeman in and agreed to let him search the house. Lorcan grew even more nervous. The police officer searched Lorcan's room, but didn't find anything suspicious. Then, he opened the wardrobe and noticed a hole in the ceiling. When he poked his head up through the hole and peered into the attic, his eyes were greeted by a horrifying sight. Later, he would say it was the single most disturbing thing he had ever seen in his life. The dead body of the missing boy was hanging from the roof. His arms and legs were tied to the rafters of the attic in the shape of a crucifix. Beneath him was a satanic altar, surrounded by books on devil worship. On the altar was a silver chalice filled with blood. The policeman scrambled downstairs and raised the alarm. He shouted for his colleagues, and when he told them what he had seen, they began a desperate search for Lorcan, but the teenager was nowhere to be found. His parents had no idea where he was. Policemen on the street swore they hadn't seen anyone leave the house. Nobody could find any trace of the teenage boy. The police were baffled. They were sure there was no way the boy could have escaped without being noticed. It was a complete mystery. Later on, one of the officers did recall witnessing something strange. He said that just after all the commotion had started, he thought he saw something fly out of one of the upstairs windows. It flapped its wings and disappeared into the night. He thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but he could have sworn it was a large, black bat. The Bloody Fingers is a scary story about spooky ghost. The Alexander Hotel had a lot of trouble with room 1313. Aside from its unfortunate number, the room really was haunted. The management tried to avoid renting the room, because the guests never stayed through the night. But there was a convention in town, and every hotel room for miles around was booked. So when a tired-looking salesman appeared at the desk begging for a room, the clerk took pity on him and gave him the key to room 1313. "I warn you," said the clerk. "It's haunted." "I'm not afraid of ghosts," said the salesman. The salesman was exhausted from traveling. He went directly to his room and started to unpack. When he opened the closet, a ghost came out, and it was a particularly horrible ghost too. It waved its bleeding hands in the air and shouted, "Bloody fingers! Bloody fingers!" The salesman decided that he wasn't so tired after all, and besides he really was afraid of ghosts, so he left immediately. Next came a soldier. He was on his way home for a leave, but had missed his plane connection and couldn't get another flight until the following morning. "I'm afraid the only room we have is haunted, sir," said the clerk. "Tvi fought in 3 wars," said the soldier. "I've seen men die all around me. I don't believe in ghosts." So he went up to the room. Once again the ghost came out of the closet and waved its hands in the air and moaned, "Bloody fingers! Bloody fingers!" The soldier decided he would sleep in the airport. It got to be very late, and the clerk didn't expect any more guests. One showed up though. He had long shaggy hair and a scraggly beard. He wore torn levis and carried a battered guitar case. The clerk didn't much like his looks. So he gave him the haunted room. The fellow ambled into the room, sat down on the bed, took out his guitar, and began to play softly. The ghost popped out of the closet and, waving his crimson and dripping hands in the air, moaned, "Bloody fingers! Bloody fingers!" The man kept right on strumming and humming, not paying the slightest attention to the ghost. "Bloody fingers! Bloody fingers!" moaned the ghost more loudly. The guitar player barely looked up. "Bloody fingers! Bloody fingers!" shrieked the ghost. The guitar player stopped, looked over at the ghost, and very slowly said, "Need a band-aid, man?"